You've probably seen me use an amazing tool called BuildShip to build fairly complex apps. Indeed, it's an awesome no-code tool that nicely complements another app building tool such as Flutterflow. This approach allows you to build out your app's UI using a tool such as Flutterflow and then develop all your logic flows in BuildShip. And so in today's video, I want to share with you some important getting started tips that allow you to hit the ground running quickly and easily. And I'll also close out this video with some powerful and easy to leverage techniques that you can use for your next app. All right, so here we are in BuildShip, and as you can see, I already have one workflow, a fairly complex workflow that I built for a previous app. And so the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a new workflow, and we can do that by clicking this button here, and we've created a new workflow that by default is titled Untitled Workflow. Now the next thing that I like to do is I like to rename this workflow because the name is fairly generic and not very descriptive. So I'm going to click on settings here, and I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call it workflow 1, which is equally as generic, but at least I know what this workflow is about. So I'm going to hit save. Now, the first thing that you want to do when you're creating any workflow is you need a trigger, but you also need to do something else. So a lot of people know about the trigger, but a lot of people miss out about this important next step. So we're going to create a trigger, and typically you're going to start with a REST API call unless you have a very, very good reason for some of the other triggers. So I'm going to select this REST API, add this trigger, and then I'm going to configure it. So I'm just going to call it test here, and I'm just going to leave it as a get request. This is fine. Get works for fairly simple requests. Now at this point, I have the beginning of my own workflow, but it's not complete yet. We've done 50%. We still need to do the other 50%. And to show you why this is not enough, let's go ahead and deploy it. And you can deploy it by clicking this ship button. So it's going to deploy it. And essentially what it's doing is it's converting all of this into code and uploading it into the cloud. So it's using the Google's infrastructure, and it has uploaded into the cloud. And now this code is available on the cloud, and you can reference it using this endpoint. So we're going to copy this endpoint, and we should have something that works, right? So if you run it, we get back this. Now, let's say I add a node that's going to be doing something useful. Well, if I click here, I can select some of the other nodes, and you have these basic operations, right? So like generate with AI, featured nodes, paste from clipboard, and then you have various sections. So you have the core, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Then you have the integrations, and you also have the various utilities. So let's say I'm going to add a utility called the crawler, and I add it here. So now we have two nodes, and let's say this crawler, I'm going to give it a starting URL. So this URL, let's say we give it Hacker News, which is a great website if you are into tech. And let's say we configure a selector. So I'm just going to put a container right here. Now, if we deploy it, we should have the beginning of a real app. So if I copy this here and I paste it here, let's see what happens. Okay, so it says okay. And why does it say okay when we are using a crawler? Well, this brings me to a tip. And the tip is that you always want to have not only a webhook, but you always want to have the so-called return node. And you can find this as the first node in this course section. So anytime you're creating a workflow, you always want to start with two nodes, okay? Your webhook node or your trigger node and the return node. And then in the middle, you're going to have the actual logic where you're going to be doing something, whether sending a request to OpenAI, crawling, talking to a database, etc., etc. But you always want to have your main logic wrapped inside of these two nodes, because if you don't have these nodes, you're not going to have a functioning app, okay? So now here we can specify what we want to return, right? Because we've done our logic here, but we're not outputting anything, right? Which is the job of this node. So here I can say, hello world, and if I deploy it here, we're going to get back, okay, 200, hello world. I come over here and I click here, and we should have hello world when we execute this. Now, the reason that's taking some time is because it's doing all the crawling, and we're not really kind of looking into that. We're simply outputting hello world. And so just to emphasize, you want to start with a trigger node and you want to end with a return node, and then in the middle you will put all of your logic. Now, the next important tip that I want to give you is that you want to define your request. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, this is our first node here, so which means that this node receives the request, right? So if you use a browser or you use an app to send the request, which is what you're going to be doing from Flutterflow, or like we are testing from a browser or a third-party tool, we are sending a request, and along with that request, we are telling it what we want to do, and we're also giving it additional data, right? So with this request, we're simply referencing this workflow here, which is what we called it, this test workflow, which is denoted by this path equals test, okay? This allows us to send it to a specific workflow, and this BuildShip tool will understand that when we send a request to test, we want this workflow to function. But along with the path, we can also send additional data, right? So with a GET request, you're kind of limited, right? With a POST request, you can send more data, but still with a GET request, you can send something called a query string, right? So if I go back here, I have this test. Well, I can say, well, name equals James. Okay, so let's say I want to send some extra data, and because we need this data, right? It's dynamic. We are gonna have the user or the app or whatever you might have sending data. This data is going to be dynamic, but we know that the app or whoever is sending this data is going to be passing name, and this name equals something, in this case James. This is going to be dynamic, but because we know name is going to be in there, we can tell BuildShip that we know that name is going to be there. So keep an eye on name for us, right? And the way you do it is by clicking here, and then you click on edit, and here you can edit all kinds of things that we're going to get to in just a second. But right now you want to click on request, and when you click on request, you have all of these things that BuildShip knows about, right? So it knows about a query, which is your query arguments, right? That we're going to be passing, that we're passing right now, essentially. It knows about a possible body as well as request headers, right? So when you are doing a GET request, you're typically not going to be passing a body. A body is only going to be passed if you're dealing with POST requests. But with a query, regardless whether you're doing a POST or a GET, you can pass query arguments. And so what you want to do is you want to click on query, and you can click here, and you can give it the various things, like you can assign names or keys, as they're called, that are going to be inside of this query string object, okay? So I've just created a new key, and I'm going to give it a name, right? So I know this is going to be, it's going to be name, right? Because that's what we have, but we don't know the value, right? The value is going to be dynamic. So we're going to give it name here, and here I'm going to give it a label called name as well. Now, label is important because label allows you to reference this specific request element here, this request key, from other nodes, okay? So key is important because key is actually the part of the request, whereas name here is so that you can find it easily, right? You can call it anything that you want as long as you know what it means, okay? Next, you want to click on save. Very, very important. You want to click on save, otherwise it's not going to save anything, okay? So now this node here will know not only about the query object, which is always the case, it's also going to know about the specific data. So in this case, we're telling it that, hey, expect the name, okay? So we gave it name, and here we're doing something, okay? We're doing something, we're just going to leave it as is, but let's say you want to output something having to do with the name, right? Well, in this case, you can click here, and you can click on variables, and now you have access to the previous node. So we have access to the crawler node here, and we have access to this request node here, which is this webhook trigger node. So instead of clicking on request, you can click here, and you can click on query, and you can select name, and that's only going to give you access to this name. And so here, this is going to reply with the name. So we're gonna deploy it right here, Okay, it's deploying right now. Okay, it has deployed. Go back here. Now I'm giving it name equals James, right? So this is what I'm kind of sending it, and it should know what name is because we've told it, right? And we are referencing it, okay? So it should say James, okay? We're going to execute this. It's going to take a couple of seconds because of that crawler node that we have that we're not yet using, but we are going to be using. But it should output James right here, okay? Okay, and there you see James here, okay? So this is an important tip because as you're building more and more complex apps, it's going to make your life a lot easier, right? So you can work with requests. You're going to be working with body, right? If you're going to be sending like a lot of data in a post request, you're going to be dealing with body as well. So as an example, let's say we're working with a post request, and inside the body, I am going to be sending in a, I don't know, like city. Okay, so I'm going to be passing the city. But not only that, I'm going to be passing something else. I'm going to be passing a state. Okay, so just to show you how it works. So now this is going to expect a body, right? So this is going to be a post request with a body, and it's going to be expecting city and state. So we're going to hit save, and we're going to change this to post. Okay, so this is going to be a post request now. We're going to click on ship so that it ships it. And in fact, we need to change this right here. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to go into request, and I'm going to go into body, and I'm going to select, I can do both, right? So I can click on city, and I can put a comma, variables, request, body, state. And now it's going to format it as a city, comma, state. So we're going to exit out, hit ship or deploy, copy this. But the problem now is because this is a post request, you can't really send it from a browser. Okay, so if you do that, you should get an error, right? Workflow not found. And that is because there is no such thing as a get workflow. We only have a post workflow. So technically that workflow that we're trying to exit with a get request does not exist anymore. Okay, so in this case, we need to use another tool. And I like to use Rapid API, which is a free tool for Mac. So if you have a Mac and you like free tools, you don't want to pay for a tool, you like this tool, I really like this tool, you can Google for it and you can download it. If you're using another platform, Linux, PC, whatever, there's lots and lots of tools such as this one. So don't get upset. All right, so here we're going to go into file. We're going to create a new request. We're going to open up a new window. And here we're going to create a post request, paste this URL. And now if we go into body, we can create a body request. And this is going to follow a JSON format, right? And the way this works is that you want to open curly braces, and then you're going to say city. And let's say the city is Miami, and state, let's say the state is Florida. Okay, close the braces. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to click on JSON so that it validates it, right? So if you go back to text, it has nicely formatted, okay? And so if we go back to our workflow, what should the result be? It should be Miami, comma, Florida, okay? So let's go ahead and deploy it just in case we made some changes, which I don't think we did in this case, but this is good practice anyway. And now let's go ahead and execute and see what happens. So it's going to take a couple of seconds because of that middle node. If we remove that node, it's going to be a lot quicker. So let's go ahead and wait a couple of seconds. And this is the response that you're seeing, Miami, comma, Florida, which were part of the inputs, right? So we passed city as Miami. So as you can see here, city, Miami, state, Florida, and it responds with Miami and Florida. I had to fix the response to look like this. So if you're going to be using variables, make sure that you wrap them inside of this dollar sign and open curly brace, close curly brace, dollar sign, open curly brace, close curly brace. And you only need to do that if you are displaying variables. If you're displaying a piece of text, you don't need to do that. So if I say something like, if I do something like hello from, I don't really need to do anything with this piece of text. So if I go ahead and ship it, it should work fine. Okay. We deployed it. Let's go ahead and run it. It should say hello from. Okay. And there you see it. Hello from Miami, Florida. And so as you can see, this particular technique is very, very useful. Okay. It's very, very useful so that you can reference all the data everywhere, whether from a request or somewhere else, from other nodes, right? Because you're going to be building your workflow, it's going to have multiple nodes. You'll be able to reference it pretty much from anywhere. So make sure that you put this to good use. Now, this next specific tip is actually something that I discovered fairly recently, and it would have come in handy if I knew about it before, because it can really help you a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this node for now. We may add it in the future. And so now we have a very simple workflow. Now, depending on what you may send and depending what's going to happen, typically you want to see what's happening in your workflow, right? You don't want to just keep deploying it and seeing the results, which is essentially what you're going to be doing while you're testing it, right? What you want to have access to is the variables as your workflow is executing, right? And the easiest way to do it, instead of constantly deploying it and printing out the variables, is you can log it. So if you click here, you can search for log. Okay, and if you scroll down, you see this utility node called log message to console, and this is very helpful. Okay, so we're gonna click here, add this node, and now we have a special node that will log pretty much anything that we want to the console. Okay, and what is the console? Well, the console is a place that displays all the stuff that are only available to developers. Okay, so this stuff is just information, something that's happening, various nodes, anything that you want to see so that you can confirm that the workflow works, that you do not want to make available to your end users. Okay, and typically this is something that you need to do while you're testing your app. So as an example, remember we have this webhook here, and we are passing something that looks like this. We have a request and we have city and state. Now, let's say you want to make sure that this workflow works as expected, and you don't even care about this return node here, right? You may not even have it, so I'm just going to delete it for now, right? And so as you're sending this request, you want to make sure that you're parsing it correctly, right? Because remember, we have this thing here, we have the city and name, but let's say you're passing in a city and that city is not, it's not being outputted correctly, or it's not being used as an input somewhere. So what you want to do is you want to make sure the city is actually, your workflow is capturing the request properly. And so what you can do here is you can log a message. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, city is city, and then I can say, well, I'm going to input a variable here, and I'm going to come in here, body input city. And now we have a log message that was generated for us. And so now if you exit out, and let's say I ship it, I ship this workflow, I deploy it, when we run it, we should see a message with the variable in the log, right? And where's the log? Well, if you click here, you see all your logs. So every time you run the workflow, you're going to have a new entry here, right? So what I recommend is clicking here so that you can see the newest log entry, okay? Have all of these things refreshed. And so now let's go ahead and send that same request. We're not going to get this output here because we deleted the response node, but we should have an entry in the logging. Okay, so I'm going to execute this request. It should be very fast. We get an OK, which is the default response. And now if we go back to BuildShip and we do a refresh so that we see the latest entry, and we open it up, right? We expand it. You should see logging information, right? So in this case, you see this logging. So if you open that up, you see logging here, right? And as you can see, it says city Miami, which means it's capturing the city correctly. And now you can come back here and you can do something else. You can say state, and you can do state is a state, right? So query body state. You can do that. You can close that. And now it should list all the variables that we care about. So this is very helpful. Believe me, I wish I had known about this before, because it would have saved me so much pain. Okay, so now let's go ahead and deploy it. And now if you run the request, you should have another logging entry with more information. So in this case, you're going to have city and state together. So let's go back here. Let's go rerun it. It's very fast. And here you want to refresh it. So you get the last entry here, okay? So this is the last entry. You can also turn on auto fetch. That's going to automatically fetch the last log entry. And so this is the last log entry here. And you want to make sure that you either have auto fetch turned on or you do it manually, because otherwise you're going to be looking at old log entries, right? That are obviously not going to have the information that you're looking for because you've done some changes in your app. And so the logging information, maybe from yesterday or like from an hour ago, is not going to accurately reflect what you have in your app right now. So you want to make sure that you're either doing it manually here or you have auto fetch turned on. I just recommend turning on auto fetch. All right, so this is the last logging entry here. And if you scroll down, you see this logging entry, okay? And you see everything, right? You can see it here. But if you have a more complex log entry, you might have to expand it and see it right there. So now we know that this system, this workflow in BuildShip is correctly getting the variables, which is a half of the battle, or even more than half the battle. Because a lot of times you're passing in data, you're sending in the request, but it's not picking it up for whatever reason. Maybe you have a bug here, maybe the system has a bug, there's a bug somewhere, and that means none of your nodes, your entire workflow is pretty much, can be thrown out the window, right? Because you're not capturing the request. So here you can see that this is being captured correctly, and we are good to go. So we can keep building the nodes, right? And I definitely recommend that you guys do this in the beginning, right? You have your webhook trigger node, you expect certain variables, right? Or maybe even, you're not like picking out the individual variables. You can log the whole request. You can log all the headers. You can log everything about the request. You can just log, and then you can kind of analyze, right? You can check it out. You can see if you're getting the right information. And once you made sure of that, you can continue building. Now, this next tip here is going to save you a ton of time, okay? So let's say we have this workflow, we have a test, post, we have a logging, and let's say we're outputting something. So I'm just going to do a return node here, and let's say it's 200, and we want to output the name of the city. Okay, so I'm going to go into request, body, and just city. That's all I really care about. So now we have a complete workflow, right? We have the trigger node, we have the response node, and we have a logging. Okay, so very, very basic workflow, but still a complete workflow. Now, there's two things that you can do at this point, okay? You can ship it, you can deploy it, which takes a little bit of time, right? It can take a couple of seconds, it can take 30 seconds sometimes, it really depends. Or you can test it, right? Now, this is going to save you a lot of time. So let me show you how this works, right? If you click here, this essentially simulates a request, right? So here you can fill in all the stuff for a request. It's kind of like making a fake request, right? Because why would you want to deploy it and then go ahead and fetch a tool to test the request if you're simply at the testing stage, right? You want to be using this testing feature here. This is an awesome feature. And in fact, lots of tools that like this don't even have this feature. It's going to save you a lot of time. So if you click here, it's already filling in the name for you. Okay, I don't think James was there. I think I put that myself, but name is definitely going to be filled out for you. And so this means that you can send in a request with the query parameters, right? And this is great, except that we're not really using these query parameters, right? We are sending a body. So you're going to come in here, and what you can do is, well, I already have the body here. I can just copy it here and paste it in here. If you didn't have it, you'll just do it manually, okay? And then you can also go into headers and send a header if you want. So this is enough. We're going to click on test workflow, and let's see what happens. And there it is. And like in less than a second, we get a response type, which is what we have here, and we get back the actual value, right, which is the city here. Now, let's go ahead and change this to something else. Let's say I do something like hello from. Okay, now if we do that, we need to wrap it in backticks and put this inside this with the dollar and the semicolons, okay? Excuse me, the dollar and the curly braces, okay? So once we have that, go back into test, go into body, we have this request. Everything is there, right? You don't have to re-enter the request stuff. The request query string or the request body, it's all there. Click on test workflow. It's building, executing, there it is. Less than a second, or was that a second? I don't even know what that was, okay? Very, very quickly. And as you can guess, that's a lot quicker than, clicking on ship and waiting for it to deploy, and then, using a tool. All of that is going to take time. You want to do it quickly. Let's try something else. I'm going to go into body, and let's say San Diego, California. Let's put CA. It should say hello from San Diego. Okay, now if I modify this and I say and state, or just something like this, and here I can insert a new variable, request body state, and we're gonna wrap it like this, and we're gonna come back to test body. Now it should also reference the state. Test workflow, building, executing, hello from San Diego and CA. Very, very quickly, right? And this allows you to move fast. That's kind of what you want. You want to be moving fast. And, when you're building anything, you're building an app, you're doing it from scratch, you're building a Flutterflow app, you're building a BuildShip app, you're always going to be testing, right? You're always going to be testing because you're going to be making bugs, right? That's kind of the name of the game, really, right? And so as you can see, it's very, very fast, and it's very, very helpful. Now, this is just one way of testing, right? Here, this allows us to test the entire workflow, but we can also test the individual node, right? So if you click on any of your nodes, you're going to have this play icon, right? So if you click on that, you can test a particular node, because if you think about a workflow, you have the input in the beginning. That's typically your request. Not always, but typically going to be the request. And then you have an output at the end, right? With a node, you also have an input into the node and the output into the node. So when you combine all the nodes, you're only dealing with the endpoints. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add another node that we can test individually, right? So we're going to click here, and let's say I want to add a node that does something with AI, right? We're going to be using OpenAI, and I'm going to do chat. Now, right now, this node is part of the workflow, but because it has a play icon, we can test it separately, right? So I can click here, and we have another dialog box, and I can just simply fill out the values, and that's going to run this node separately, right? It's not going to run it as part of a workflow. So I'm going to fetch my API key right here. I have my key, system prompt, you're a helpful assistant, and the user request. What's the capital of Mexico? Okay. Pick a model that we want and run this specific node, and let's see what we get. And as you can see, we got a result. Output, the capital of Mexico is Mexico City. So now you know that this specific node works with the inputs that we have provided, and that means that pretty much any input is going to work, provided that you're using a valid API key and provided that you have given it reasonable prompt. So this is very, very helpful, because now you can just test individual nodes with their own input and output instead of testing an entire workflow by giving it an input and output. Obviously, we can click here and we can test this entire workflow as well. And this is something that you should be doing as well. But starting out, you want to be testing out these nodes individually. And by the way, you can click on this green icon and see the previously outputted result, right? So as you can see, we have this result here. This is a JSON object, and you can copy this value if you may need it for something else, but it's there. Now, my next tip is going to be a little bit more advanced, and this is going to come in very, very handy as you're building more and more complicated and customized workflow. Let's say you want to add a node, but you're not quite sure if there's a right node for what you're trying to do, right? You've browsed all the nodes and you've searched around back and forth, up and down and up, but you can't really find the right node. Well, in this case, you can select an empty node, add this node here, and you can get this node to do pretty much anything that you want. You can write a little app that's going to be executed as part of this node. So right now, this node expects a name as a parameter, but you can modify that, right? You can click here and you can change this mode to do pretty much anything that you want. So for instance, if we go into input, it has name. You can give it another parameter, right? You can call this parameter city, and I can say city. You can go into output and you can define the kind of things that this node is going to be outputting. Right now, as you can see, the output is called output and it's of type string. So you can change it into an array, a boolean, a number, something that you should be familiar if you have worked with Flutterflow and you've built custom functions. You can also define what kind of value is going to be returning, as well as the arguments it's going to be taking in. So it's very, very similar to Flutterflow's custom functions, or pretty much how you customize any piece of custom logic in any no-code app builder, okay? And so let's say we have name and city as our inputs, right? Name and city. And if you come over to this node logic here, you have access to all of this information. And so right now we have access to name, but if I put comma and I put city, we now are going to have access to name and city. So right now this returns hello. And so that means we can actually save this, and we can also test this node, right? So let's say we click here and we want to test the values, right? So let's say the name is James, the city is NYC, and if I run this node, what do I get back as the result? I get hello. And so now you can click here and you can get it to output something else. So you can say, well, I want it to output name, right? So you can do name here and click save. And in fact, you don't need to hit save and get out. You can actually test it right here. So let's say I give it James, and the city, I'm going to give it NYC. Right now, we're only outputting hello name. So I can click on test node here, and let's see what the output is. And now it says hello James. And let's say we want to take into account the city as well. Hello James from, and we're going to say city. Okay, let's go ahead and test it out and see what it says. Hello James from NYC. And so this obviously gives you the freedom to do anything that you want, right? This is essentially JavaScript, right? So you can go to ChatGPT and you can ask it to build a custom app. And typically the way you're going to be doing it is you're going to be copying this, you're going to give it to ChatGPT, and you're going to say, well, here's a sample template of a function. You're going to paste this, you're going to copy and paste this, and then you're going to ask ChatGPT to do pretty much anything that you want, you know, whether to send a request somewhere or output something or anything that you want. I'm actually thinking about making a complete separate video on this topic right here. So if you want to see a more kind of deep dive on using ChatGPT and building your custom nodes or anything of that sort, let me know in the comments below. But right here, you have access to anything, right? This is your JavaScript. So this is obviously going to be for more advanced stuff. It's the same thing with, you know, custom widgets in Flutterflow, or custom functions, or custom actions. You have Flutterflow, you have that, you know, drag and drop UI builder. But anytime you need something a little bit custom, something a little bit more advanced, you should have the ability to do it. And this is exactly how you do it, using this custom node. And so obviously you can, you know, you can enter more code here, you can give it more parameters. It's a little app that runs within that bigger app called the workflow, okay? So you can customize it, you can do a ton of cool things. So as an example, if I go into inputs, I can add another input, let's say state and state. And I have it here, which is what's going to be displayed as I'm building my workflow. And then if I go into node logic, I can say from city, from, and I want to put it here, state, and then state here, okay? Okay, so now there's no issues, not everything looks good. Let's go ahead and state NYC New York, test this node right here and see what we get. As you can see, hello James from NYC from New York. Now all of these tips are very, very helpful, and they're gonna help you hit the ground running so that you can start building workflows, whether they're simple or a little bit more complex. But the real power of this tool lies in some of the more complex and more powerful things that you can do with it. Namely, what you can do is you can click here, let's say, and you want to add another node, and you have access to very, very interesting nodes, right? So in this core section, you can do parallel, you can do repeating. You also have this empty node, which is what I just talked about, that allows you to essentially customize it to any way that you want. But let me show you a very, very powerful node that will allow you to achieve a lot of interesting things. So if you click on parallel and you add this node, and what this node allows you to do is it allows you to create nodes that will be executed in parallel. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete this empty node. We don't really need it. and leave this parallel as kind of the middle, the intermediate node, right? So we have the first node, we have the last node, and then we have these intermediate nodes. And so in this case, what we can do is we can add logic that's going to be executed in parallel. So not sequentially, how typically it's done. It's going to be executed in parallel. And so what do we want to do? Well, let's say that we want to call OpenAI, and we want to create two calls that are going to be executed in parallel. And so I'm going to search for OpenAI. I'm going to send a chat here, and I can also click here. I can copy this, click here, and I can do paste from clipboard. Okay, click here. Now we've created two nodes that are going to be executed in parallel. So we're going to get our API keys here, API key here, API key here. We're going to create a system prompt. You're my helpful assistant. And let's say the same system prompt. And let's say for the user request, I'm going to ask it, what is 5 times 5? And here I'm going to say, what is 10 times 10? And we're going to select the model. Let's say we want to use, I don't know, 3.5 turbo is going to suffice. And now when we run this whole workflow, these nodes are going to be executed in parallel. Okay. So in fact, we can just test it out, right? We can just simply test it out because we don't really need to deploy it now. We can deploy it if we want to, but right now testing is going to be sufficient. So we're going to click here. And because this specific workflow does not depend on our requests, we don't really need to fill anything out. We're just going to click on test workflow and see what happens, see the kind of result that we get. Okay. And now it's telling us hello from undefined and undefined. Now, the reason we see that is because of this, right? We don't have city and state. We're not working with those variables. But one thing you should notice is that this has ran successfully. So if you click here, you're going to see the output. And so this is awesome because we see that these these nodes were successful, right? And so what we can do now is we can click here, we can delete all this, we can delete all this here, and we can go into variables, and I'm going to click on parallel, and I'm going to select the first OpenAI chat. I'm going to select this output here. And in fact, what I can do is I can just click here, and I can go into parallel. Just give me everything. All the nodes that were executed in parallel, just show me what happened. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this again. Test workflow, and we should see the actual data now, because that's what this output node is tasked with. And there we see it. So what we have here is we have an object that contains two other objects. So this is our object here. So let me show you. Let me show you what's happening. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to use a tool called JSON Viewer. I'm going to paste this, and that way you can see it easily, right? So as you can see, we have an object. We have one object, which is that JSON object. And inside that JSON object, we have two more objects. And the output of each object is this right here. And this is because that's how OpenAI nodes are configured, right? So if you come over here, you see output. This is this output right here. That's how that specific OpenAI node is configured, right? We get output, but we also have another output as the field inside the output object, which is exactly what you're seeing here. You're seeing the object and then the output field. And so this is another nice thing, is that if you're using any of the built-in nodes, you want to go into output and you want to see how the data is being fetched, how the data is being gotten. So that way you can just reference the exact data. Very, very helpful, and it's going to save you a ton of time. But regardless, now we've executed a workflow that has two parallel nodes. And obviously you can add more nodes that you want to have executed in parallel. And this could be pretty much anything, right? Let's say you're building a crawler and you want to crawl multiple sites in parallel, or you want to do a calculation in parallel, or you want to access one LLM, then another LLM in parallel. There's so many things that you can do, and this is very, very powerful. And in fact, I haven't really seen this functionality all that much when it comes to other tools. Very, very awesome functionality. Definitely recommend it. And this is just the beginning. There's so many other things that you can do with this amazing tool, especially when you look at core modules, right? You can do branching, looping, you can do repeat. And plus you have tons of different integrations, which are essentially nodes that do something specific, right? Pre-built nodes that use a specific platform or a specific tool or a specific product to do something, right? So things like Algolia, Replicate, database, file storage, Google Cloud Storage, lots and lots of amazing things that allow you to build fairly complex workflows without really needing to code, unless this is something you have to do. And if you need to add some code, you can do that as well, like I explained in this video. So an awesome tool. Definitely give it a try. I've been using it for my apps and I'm very, very happy with it. Now, if you guys are impressed with BuildShip like I am, and you're thinking about using it with some of the apps that you're going to be building in the future, or maybe you're using it right now, then you definitely need to check out our amazing Patreon community, because just recently, like a week ago, I did a deep dive on BuildShip, right? I talked about BuildShip. I talked about some of the struggles, some of the interesting techniques that I use when I was building a fairly complex workflow, right? So we had like one workflow, and then this thing was calling other workflows. So it was a fairly complex app. And I shared with you guys some of the things that went inside my head as I was building this app, but also some of the tips and tricks that I learned while building a fairly complex app that are going to be useful just about anyone, right? Whether you're building a simple app or a more complex app. And so if you're looking to do a BuildShip, or if you're just looking to build, Flutter Flow apps or no-code apps, regardless what you're going to be doing, you definitely need to check out our amazing Patreon community, because over there, you're going to find more content. You'll be able to view and or clone my Flutter Flow no-code apps. You'll also be able to view and or clone some of my templates here in the future once this functionality becomes available. And you're going to have access to more content, right? So Q&As, our deep dives, some of the other content that I put out for our special members. It's all there. And beyond all that, when you join our amazing Patreon community, you're going to be supporting this channel and supporting my work. And that is highly, highly appreciated. So if you're getting value from the content that I'm putting out, whether it's these videos or some of the apps that I'm building, workflows, you name it, you're going to find more content there. Plus, you're going to interact with amazing community that's eager to learn, and they're always helping each other. And plus, I'm providing support as well. So definitely check it out. You can learn more about it using the link in the description, and hopefully I will see you there.